This is Nia Kamau on the 5th of October 2020 at around 4 p.m. interviewing Ambassador Robert Jordan for the Tower Center. This interview is being recorded using Zoom. How are you doing today, Ambassador Jordan?
Great. It's a beautiful day outside. Nice to be talking with you.
Thank you. Well, could you start off by telling us when and where you were born?
Well, I was born a couple of centuries ago in 1945, and I was born in Wichita, Kansas. My father was in the Navy during World War II, and he was just finishing up. He was preparing to invade Japan, I guess, when the truce was reached, and so he was able to come home in time for me to be born at my grandparents' residence in Wichita.
Wow, that's an exciting birth story.
Yeah.
So you mentioned your family and your grandparents. Can you please tell us more about your family and about your upbringing?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My grandfather on that side of the family moved to Tulsa in 1907, right at the time Oklahoma became a state. My mother's father on the other side, the one who lived in Wichita, had actually been a U.S. Marshal in Indian Territory before statehood. So the tradition of living in Oklahoma goes way back. And I spent most of my childhood in Tulsa with a few exceptions.
Thank you for sharing. So as a young person, what did you consider as some of your goals for your future life? Obviously, you had some great family figures who sounds like were doing great work, but what did you envision yourself doing as a young person?
Well, I had kind of an unusual early childhood. When my father came back from the Navy, when I was 3 years old, we moved to Peru. He had been in the international oil field supply business before he went in the Navy in the war. And so when he came back, he got a job running an oil field warehouse in a tiny town, a coastal town in northern Peru. So we moved to this tiny town and lived there for 2 years. Spanish was my everyday language. I went to kindergarten there. And so when we came back, a lot of our dinner table conversation was regarding international things. We would occasionally speak Spanish at the dinner table just for fun. And so that kind of colored a little bit of my early upbringing. But I suppose, like most kids, I wanted to be a baseball player like Mickey Mantle, or just someone who was going to be successful. My mother always said, "You can do anything you think you can," and so that was kind of the motto growing up.
It sounds like your mom was a very wise woman. So where did you end up going to middle school and high school? What was your education like during your formative years?
I went to a middle school and high school in Tulsa called Edison, named after Thomas Edison. And it was, at the time I was there in high school, ranked by Look magazine or Life magazine as the third best public high school in the country. So it was very academically oriented. I was in a sort of a college prep program, taking early versions of calculus, and lots of extracurricular activities. So I was the editor of the school short story magazine, had a lot of friends who were very active in various academic ventures. And so I was probably kind of one of the nerds in the class at the time, but also had a lot of great friends who had a good time.
Sounds like you were very prepared for higher education.
Well, I was lucky. I had a great foundation from high school, and also my parents were very attentive to my academic progress.
Wow, that's incredible. So when you did eventually make it to college, can you please share some of your experiences at your university and what prompted you to consider your later career path?
Sure. Well, I ended up going to Duke University, and we didn't have a lot of money, so I had actually never made a college visit. I had never been to Duke, but my college counselor recommended it to me. They offered me some money to attend, And so I got on an airplane for the second time in my life, the first time being when we moved to Peru, and flew off to Durham, North Carolina. Little did I know that I was arriving at Duke in 1963 as a member of the first class that was racially integrated at Duke. It had been segregated up to that point, and of course, living in Oklahoma, I had no idea about all this at that time. And so I showed up there. We had 7 African-American fellow classmates who were all terrific, and later in life all went on to become significant leaders in their fields. But it made me start realizing that I had kind of lived in a bubble in a way, and there were a lot of parts of the world that I didn't know about. And so I got very interested in politics, in political activity, and international relations. I joined what was called the Student Union, which was the largest student organization on campus. And ultimately, by the time I was a senior, I became chairman of the Student Union. And it really gave me a tremendous opportunity. We were in charge of all of the major speakers programs on campus, as well as the major entertainment. So they would fly me to New York and Washington, and I would meet members of the Senate. I would go to New York and meet potential entertainers to audition to come on campus, and got to meet great speakers like Ted Sorensen, who was John Kennedy's speechwriter, Mike Mansfield, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time, toured the White House. And then when I went to New York, I was able to book entertainment acts like the Righteous Brothers. One Sunday afternoon, we had a small concert that I was in charge of. And we had this little girl with very bad complexion named Linda Ronstadt in a group called the Stone Pony. So I got to do all of that, introduce them on stage, learned a little bit about speaking in public, and had a great time, but also learned a lot about putting together organizations, about leadership. We had many committees, board members, and faculty advisors, all of whom I had to manage in a way. So it was a terrific experience for me.
Sounds like you did a lot of productive things, but that also sounds like some really fun experiences.
Absolutely. It was a wonderful time in life.
Okay. So what did you do after graduating from Duke?
Well, this was during the height of the Vietnam conflict. And so I joined the Navy. My dad had been in the Navy. I thought being in the Navy would be a great way to serve my country. I was able to go to officer candidate school in Newport, Rhode Island, and got my commission in April of 1968. In college, I had studied Russian for a couple of years. And in fact, one summer in college, my parents were living in Hong Kong at the time, and I was able to spend a summer in Hong Kong with a Russian tutor teaching me Russian then. So I volunteered for what's called the Naval Security Group, which was part of the National Security Agency. They were the people intercepting enemy communications in Vietnam and elsewhere. And so I figured I'd probably be assigned to a minesweeper out in the Gulf of Tonkin, listening in on Russian communications. Well, they accepted me into the security group, but instead of sending me overseas on a ship, they sent me to headquarters in Washington, D.C. So I spent the entire time in the Navy in Washington. Again, I had a great job. I was the administrative officer for the headquarters there. Got to see a lot of Washington, D.C. and continued to have kind of the public policy bug at that point. While I was there, I got a master's in government from the University of Maryland by going out at night to College Park to the campus there and completing my master's degree while I was in the Navy.
Okay. So I know that after you went to Maryland, you also got a JD, is that correct?
Yes, I came back home then to Oklahoma, to the University of Oklahoma Law School on the GI Bill. It was about the only way I could afford to go to law school. And I think I paid $400 a semester to go to law school. But it was a great experience for me at that time as well.
Okay. So it seems like the public policy bug stayed with you for a minute because, of course, we know that you practiced law, but eventually became a U.S. ambassador. Could you describe for us what this journey looked like, this transition?
Sure. Well, when I moved to Dallas then to start practicing law after law school in 1974, and I worked with a small boutique firm that specialized in antitrust and securities litigation. And my mentor at that time was a man named Morris Harrell, who had been president of the State Bar of Texas, and later became president of the American Bar Association, was a tremendous inspiration to me in my life. And he knew everybody in the world. And so he would make sure to introduce me to people like the president of the American Bar Association at the time, justices of the Texas Supreme Court. And I got a little bit involved in some judicial campaigns, helping some judges get elected. Then in 1985, I was approached by the Baker Botts law firm, the firm of former Secretary of State James Baker's grandparents, actually grandfather and great-grandfather, started in 1862, I think. And they asked if I'd be willing to help them start an office in Dallas. They had been Houston-based entirely at that point. And so I moved over to that law firm and continued to see the history of the lawyers in that firm, some of whom had been high-level Justice Department officials. Of course, the James Baker connection hadn't really come through yet because he had been in government and did not come to the Baker Botts law firm until 1993, after President George H.W. Bush was defeated for re-election. But the public policy interest continued during that period, and I was asked to take on a case involving supposed insider stock trading in 1991. And the company hired me to represent the company and the person who was being investigated. And it turned out that that person was named George W. Bush. And so George Bush and I worked very closely together for a couple of years until I could convince the Securities and Exchange Commission to dismiss the investigation, which they did. Bush thought I was a genius for doing that, and I let him keep thinking that. And we continued to be good friends. So he then in 1994 was elected governor of Texas. We would go down and visit the Bushes on the weekend sometimes and spend the night in the governor's mansion, and got to know a number of his colleagues as well. So again, the sort of the public policy bug continued in many ways. The career continued. I had some opportunities to become a judge, but decided that I needed to continue practicing law for a while. I had 3 boys to put through college and wanted to continue practicing law. So when President Bush was elected president in 2000, I called him up to congratulate him. I got his voicemail on his cell phone. And I left him a message, and then he called me back and he got my voicemail. And I still have a tape. The tape says, "Hey, Bob, this is George," or I guess I should say President-elect Bush, returning your call. And from that day on, he was no longer George. He was Mr. President. And so he asked me if I'd be interested in serving in his administration. I said, of course, anything you want me to do, as long as it's not just some honorary thing. I don't need another title, but if you've got some heavy lifting you want me to do that's helpful to you personally, then I would be honored to serve. So he called my bluff and sent me to Saudi Arabia. And when I heard about it, it was about the worst idea I had ever heard. I'd never been to Saudi Arabia, didn't speak Arabic. All I knew was that it was a tremendously hot place with no human rights, no women's rights, a very harsh version of Islam, and a lot of terrorists running around. But one night, my son was actually home from college at that point, and he turned to me and said, "You know, Dad, when your friend, the President of the United States, asks you to serve your country, you really can't say no, can you?" I said, no, Peter, that's right. I have decided I'm going to take this job. And so I spent a number of months going to Washington several days a week, trying to learn what it was about, meeting with think tanks. And this was, of course, all before 9/11. So I was expecting at that point the job was mostly going to be about oil, human rights, and maintaining the alliance. But after 9/11, that changed quite a bit.
I can only imagine. Could you dive a little deeper into that and like the difficulties, but also some of the fulfilling moments that came with being in Saudi Arabia during such a rough time?
Sure. Well, a lot of it had to do with forming personal relationships. And even in August before 9/11, I had gone down to Crawford, Texas to President and Mrs. Bush's ranch just to have lunch and talk about the Saudis. And he made it clear that his father, President Bush 41, had very deep personal relationships with a number of the Saudi leadership, which I needed to understand better. And he said, you know, my dad is actually in Kennebunkport this week with Prince Bandar, the Saudi ambassador to the United States. But he'll be back in Houston on Monday. Why don't you go down and see my dad and talk to him about Bandar and the Saudis? So I went down to Houston the next week. I spent about an hour with Bush 41. He could not have been nicer. I've met him a few times, but he really was just such a genuinely nice person. He gave me the benefit of all of his insights. And so I thanked him. I got up to leave. And he said, oh, Bob, come back, come back. He pulled out a note card from his desk and wrote out a note, put it in an envelope and gave it to me. And he said, here, give this note to Bandar when you see him. Well, I got out to my car and I realized that he had not sealed the envelope. So I took that as permission for me to look at what he had written inside. And I pulled out the note, and the note said, Dear Bandar, great being with you last week. Sorry the fish weren't biting. Please be nice to this guy or Barbara will get you. And so that was my introduction to the Saudi royal family and to Prince Bandar. And it could not have been better. I spent a lot of time trying to get to know the policymakers, the senior royals running things. And of course, I arrived in Riyadh about a month after 9/11. So feelings were running very high. The United States was confident that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. They weren't clear whether the Saudis were friend or foe. And part of my job was to figure that out. So I went to see Prince Salman, who was the governor of Riyadh at the time, and who of course now is king. And I asked him, how could it be that 15 of these hijackers were Saudis? He said, oh, no, none of these hijackers were Saudis. We had nothing to do with this. This was an Israeli plot. The Israelis were doing this to drive a wedge between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Of course, I couldn't really believe what I was hearing. And I pressed other Saudis as well, the Minister of Interior. He had the same story. But finally, I was able to meet with the Saudi Foreign Minister, Prince Saud. His father had been king in the 1970s. And Saud had gone to Princeton. He spoke better English than I did. And he understood that they had a very serious terrorism problem. Clearly he understood that the hijackers were Saudis and they needed our help to turn things around. So building on these personal relationships, I spent a great deal of time working with a number of the leadership, trying to encourage them to cooperate with our investigations, finding what other terrorist cells might be out there, helping identify who might be funding these terrorists, and working very closely with them. But you really can't work with people like this by lecturing them or telling them what's best for them. You have to work together as partners to show them that what you're working on is actually in their best interest and not just ours.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing. What do you think is one of the most significant lessons you learned during your time as an ambassador?
I think I learned that America doesn't have all the answers, and that when you're dealing with other sovereign nations, you have to remember that they have their own national interests as much as we have ours. And so what the policies are that are developed need to take into account a win-win for both sides. They have to be as invested in whatever the policy is as we do. And so sometimes you have to show them what's in their best interest. For example, my hope was that at some point the Saudis would be a more active participant in the economy of the world, in the international community, and not simply be this nation out there full of terrorists and intolerant Islamic thoughts. So my view was that if we got the Saudis into the World Trade Organization, they would be forced to reform their economy to qualify for membership, but they would see it as in their best interest because they could develop foreign direct investment. And so I set out to do that, and luckily we were able to make that progress because, again, they saw it as in their best interest to cooperate. And so now they're part of the G20. Now they are one of the leading economies in the world. And despite some serious problems that they have, they are opening their society more for foreign direct investment. Women are driving. There is more participation in society in a less restrictive way. And I think a lot of that has to do with their feeling part of what's going on around the world now and not being isolated.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and what you learned. I guess I should consider myself lucky because you brought those experiences and skills to SMU. And so I'm just curious, like, how did you find yourself here at Southern Methodist University?
Well, when I came back from Saudi in 2003, I took about 6 months off. I was exhausted, frankly, from the rigors of dealing in what was essentially a wartime environment. And I hadn't yet decided what I would do with my career. Ultimately, I decided to go back to my previous law firm, Baker Botts, which was a great thing to be doing. But Professor Hollifield invited me to get involved in the Tower Center. I was invited to join the board of the Tower Center. And then about a year later, was asked if I might be willing to teach a course on the Middle East. So somewhere in the 2004 and 5 period, I started teaching a course called Current Problems in Middle East Politics, which was essentially a discussion class, meeting for 3 hours once a week and talking about whatever the news was that week about the Middle East. It was mostly discussion, a few lectures, and occasionally I would have a guest lecturer show up for my class. I continued doing that until 2010. And then my law firm asked me to move to Dubai to run our Middle East practice in the Middle East. So I moved to Dubai and spent 4 years there. So I had to stop teaching at that point. But as soon as I came back in 2010, I jumped right back into it and have taught not every semester, but occasional semesters since then.
Okay. What would you say has been one of your most memorable or maybe one of your most fulfilling experiences working at SMU?
Working with the students, and particularly I think the Highland Capital Management Tower Scholars has been a real delight for me. I have participated in the trip to Washington, D.C. with the scholars. We have done projects together. I have been so completely impressed with the quality of the students there. And that's really been, I think, a tremendous highlight for me. Also, I've enjoyed the Middle East course, even though I don't teach it that often anymore, but it's a great opportunity, again, to talk about things that we've just been talking about here, looking at the world through other people's eyes, putting yourself in the shoes of other countries and understanding what their national interests are as you try to figure out what the policy should be. and in some ways challenging the students to keep up with world affairs, to keep up on what's going on in the Middle East. So all of that's been really refreshing for me. It's just a great bunch of students. I think it's getting more competitive every year, and the students are better every succeeding year.
What advice would you give to a college student who is interested in the career that you had in time in government or in politics?
Well, I would say, first of all, you know, my true career essentially was as a lawyer. And so if you want to become a lawyer, I think you need to have a real passion for the rule of law, for justice. And that's different sometimes from the outcomes that we see coming out of the courts. Sometimes the courts have no choice but to rule a certain way because that's what the statute says. That's what the Constitution says. And so you've got to have a real sense that we're going to follow the letter of the law. And if the law needs to be changed, that's for the legislature. But for us, we have to focus on advising clients and representing their interests according to what the law is and not what we wish it would be. Second, I think you have to be willing to work incredibly hard. Getting into law school is extremely hard. Doing well in law school is extremely hard, and you have to be willing to put in the work. And if you do, you'll succeed. And then third, I think you have to be willing to communicate. The best lawyers, I think, are those who can represent their clients by being good communicators. It's not just who can find the right case precedent in a book, in a law book or online, but it's who can really articulate to a judge or to a client or to an adversary what it is they're trying to accomplish on behalf of your client. So all of that combines to really present a challenge. Then once you're in the practice of law, if you want to get involved in politics, pick a couple of really good candidates of any party, get to know them, help them, support them. You don't have to be wealthy enough to provide a lot of money, but you can provide shoe leather, you can provide energy. One of my daughter-in-law was a photographer for one of the vice presidential candidates several years ago. Traveled around with him all over the United States. That was a great investment of her time in something that she could pay back in a way that she felt really committed to. So then combine all of that with perhaps a career in diplomacy, and that I think takes some additional skills, but the legal trainings that I had came in very handy, because you learn to be skeptical about listening to evidence. You really want solid evidence for whatever the position is that is being presented to you. And you learn to dig down beneath the surface. And then you learn to marshal arguments that you can then make to another government, sometimes to your own government. And you have had enough experience in presenting those kinds of arguments that you can do it smoothly with some authority. And it doesn't hurt to learn a few foreign languages. It doesn't hurt to live abroad. I think it's extremely helpful to those who want a career in foreign service, for example, to perhaps join the Peace Corps for a while, or some other, maybe studying abroad for a while, so they can get to know other cultures and really convince themselves that they like living in other cultures and working with people who are not just all Americans.
That's all very valuable. Thank you so much for sharing. And thank you so much for your time today. We've loved hearing your story, hearing your advice. Is there any last words that you would like to leave?
Well, let me just wish the SMU community health, security, wear your masks, socially distance, stay safe, and we'll see you on the other side.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nia.